Hello, bonjour. I'm the Moonlit Page Turner. Grab your treats, grab your tea, and let's talk books. For this month's read, we are traveling to Canada, which is actually the second largest country. It fits right under Russia and China in size. But most of the population lives within about 150 miles or 240 kilometers if you're in Canada to the border that it shares with the United States. Canada is still part of the Commonwealth, although they've been their own country since 1867. It's not until 1982 that they earn the right to change their constitution and become totally independent from England. I've read a lot of books from Canadian authors living in the United States, and so it took me a little bit to try to figure out what kind of book I wanted to read and what authors I wanted to read, because I've read quite a bit. I knew I wanted to read Margaret Atwood because she is like the Canadian author, but I've already read Handmaid's Tale, and I didn't quite want to dive back into that world with the way that our current world is right now, so I chose The Blind Assassin, which I'm totally blaming on why this video took me so long to make, because it's a little bit of a chunky book, and it took me a little bit longer to read than my normal month of reading. And I also knew that I wanted to read a book from an Indigenous author, because that was kind of my feedback that I gave to myself for Australia, is that I wish I would have read an Aboriginal author in that. And so I chose Joseph Boyden and the Three-Day Road, and then I did a little bit of digging into Boyden, and he may not have the Native American roots that he claims to be, so I read 3 books. You only see 2 right here because I actually read Five Little Indians by Michelle Good, and that is the first audiobook that I have read in this series. Before we get into this month's read, let's get into our treat. And here's another surprise for you, is that I have 2 treats this time. So I would like to say welcome back to another episode of Fried Dough Around the World. One of the treats that I made, this is Bannock, which Bannock actually has Scottish ancestries, and so when the Scottish came over to the New World, they brought their fried dough. The native population had their own version of fried dough, but they probably used corn flour instead of wheat flour. So this is wheat flour, and then it has fruit in it, and I will tell you the recipe that I will link below. You lightly cook your fruit in sugar and lemon juice, and it makes it so good. So I'm going to take a little bite. It's really good. The fried dough, and this time, is sweet because it's got sugar in it, and then you have the added sweetness of the fruit as well. Delicious. The second treat that I made is called Three Sisters Soup, and so you can kind of see that there. The first time that I heard the mythology, I've heard about the mythology of the 3 sisters in it's the Northern America Native Americans, but I actually read the mythology behind it in the book Braiding Sweetgrass, and so when I was looking for recipes for Canada, this popped up, and it looked so delicious. If you don't know the mythology of the 3 sisters, it has to do with plantation and how plants go to planting and how plants go together. And there's 3 staple crops of a lot of the indigenous culture of North America, and that is corn, beans, and squash. And so they're complementary to each other to grow together, and that's exactly what we have here in our soup. We have hominy corn, we have green beans, and we have butternut squash, and then there's also potato in here as well. And it is so good, especially with some of the cold weather that we're having right now. So both of these treats, and again, I'll link the recipes below. They came from the same website. I can't wait to try it more because both of these treats turned out excellent. Okay, the first book that I'm going to talk about is The Blind Assassin by Margaret Atwood, because not only was it the longest, it's over 500 pages. It's probably going to take me the longest to explain, because it's called The Blind Assassin, and that is a book within the book. There are actually 3 stories that tell one story, essentially, within this book. And I will say at the beginning, I was not so excited about this book. I actually considered DNFing it because it took me so long to read, and I wasn't really into it. It's not until about halfway through that you meet one character, and then everything starts clicking into place, and you're like, oh, it was a setup the whole time. This story, the main character is Iris, and we see her as an older woman towards the end of her life, and she is writing a book about her life. And we see the different chapters. Sometimes will be Iris as an older lady, and sometimes it'll be the writing that she tells of her youth. And then within the book, there's a 3rd story as well. The book actually starts with the death of Laura Chase, and that's Iris's younger sister. So Laura Chase dies in a car crash when she is 25. Then right after we hear about that, it actually, the first line, this is one of those like first line books that the first line's pretty good. It's 10 days after the war ended, my sister Laura drove a car off a bridge. And that's the first line of the book. Then after we get that information, we see almost like a news article that talks about Laura Chase's death, and she was the sister of Iris, who was the wife of one of the characters in here who's important, who is a person. Then after that, we see a chapter entitled The Blind Assassin, by Laura Chase, Renegold Janes, in Monroe, New York, 1947. And it's the prologue. So we get a book within the book called The Blind Assassin that's by Laura Chase. Hence the title of this book. And you get those throughout the book. For me at the beginning, I found it super distracting because you get the story of that Iris is telling of her growing up in Canada in like the mid 1900s. They do go through the war, and about her family. Her family owned a big factory, so they were well off when they were younger, and then we see them go through the Depression, and then we see World War II come in. That was interrupted by the story of The Blind Assassin, which is about a man and a woman that constantly meet up to have a tryst. They meet up in different locations because he's on the run, and he tells her this like sci-fi fantasy story about a blind assassin. And so you get the story within the story, and then everything starts merging together, as 3-part stories usually do. About midway through the book, you start seeing it. And then even Atwood writes as Iris of like, oh, you probably figured this out at the very end, but she clarifies it there for you. This was a Booker Prize winner in 2000, and when I started reading this book, I was like, really? This was the winner? I should have known better than that because I have read Atwood before. I did end up liking this book. It took me a long time to get into it, though. So I'm not going to fully suggest this book for other people. It is a little bit of a chunky book, and it does take a bit to get into it. But, Atwood is like the writer for a reason because she took a lot to put things in place. The people in this book are not necessarily the greatest. And I'm starting to read more and more books in the series. There's themes that keep coming through, and one of them now is, unfortunately, the exploitation of children. And in this case, it was a teenager. So, which also then comes up in our next book and our next book. So that was kind of a theme for the Canadian books. All 3 books had, molestation of children, which is awful. So sad book, beautifully put together. I think if you're into reading for story structure, you should definitely check this out. But if you're looking for like a casual story to read, I would not take this book on. All right, 3-Day Road by Joseph Boyden. This was a Today Show book club pick. This was probably my favorite out of the 3 books. It's still super sad. The gist of the story is that we have 2 best friends, and they are both young Cree men. So they are from the Cree Nation, and they go together into World War I, and they end up being in Belgium for the whole part. The way that the story is told, though, is you can see a young woman on the cover. This is Niska. Niska has grown up mostly in the bush. She will tell her story in the book, but she goes to the train station to pick up who she thinks is Elijah Whiskey Jack, which is her nephew's friend. And when she shows up at the train station, it ends up being her nephew. And so she thought her nephew was dead, and her nephew thought that she was dead, and so they're both surprised to see each other. Her nephew is Xavier, or X, and he is missing a limb, and he's in bad shape. And so she takes him by boat, by canoe, and they are going to travel back up to where Niska lives, and where X kind of grew up, because she ends up taking him out of a reservation, or a residential school, or Indian schools, with it's often referred to as, when he's young, and he grows up with her mostly. So it is their day's journey to go back, and as they're traveling, we get the story of what happened to Xavier in Belgium, and part of also growing up with Elijah, his best friend, who ends up coming to live with Niska also as a young child. And then X, again, not doing great. He also is addicted to morphine that he got mostly because of his leg. They kind of like pumped him full of it, and so now he has little vials that he takes. And as he's struggling and telling his story, Niska will talk to him to try to ease him, and she's telling him the story of her youth. So we get both stories together. I feel like this was really beautifully written. I did have an issue with Elijah grows up in the resident school, and he is molested by one of the nuns. And they hint at it, you totally get it, and then later on in the story they go into extreme detail, and it's supposed to make you uncomfortable because it's gross and awful. But I didn't need to read it. I already got the idea early on in the book. I did not need the details. There's a couple other things in here that, same thing, I was like, I didn't need the exact details of it. I got it the first time. And so that, for me, this was a 4-star instead of a 5-star read. And then you see the relationship with Elijah and Xavier, and they both become specialized snipers in World War I, and they're often together, but they grow apart with the experiences that they have there. So beautiful book. I'm really glad that I read it, because I almost skipped it, because again, Blind Assassin took forever. So I was going to skip it so that I could get this video out on time, but I'm glad that I eventually did put the time into to it. And that actually brings me to my next book, which is very similar in themes. So you don't see it on here because it's actually here. And that is 5 Little Indians by Michelle Good. And this was the first book that I ended up reading because I got it on audiobook through Libby. And it is the story of 5 little Indians, or 5 indigenous people growing up in Vancouver in the 60s and the 70s. They all have the connection of being in the residential school, or the Indian school is what they call it. We have Macy, Lucy, Clara, Howie, and Kenny. So that's the connection, is that they all were at the same school. And this is a dark part of Canadian history. This residential or Indian school, it was a mandated boarding school for Native kids. They were taken from their families. The sheriff came and would throw the parents in jail if they hid their kids. Some families actually fled to the United States so they didn't have to be there. Lots of incidences of sexual abuse, physical abuse. They still are finding mass graves of some of these kids that didn't come out of these schools. And these schools were around for about 160 years. So the last school closed in 1997. So when we look at Michelle Good, and Michelle Good is Cree, so I wanted to make sure that I read an Indigenous author. She has some experience with this, and you can definitely see it. The whole book is super sad. There are very few happy parts in it. So it is very much a downer book, but it's one of those things where it's historical. People still have issues that were in these schools. We're still dealing with, in the States, issues with the way that we treat the Native Americans. We've pretty much broken every treaty that we've ever made with them. And there is now fights when it comes to the Indigenous kids being able to be put in with Indigenous families. But we're talking Five Little Indians, 1960s, and it goes several years in. So you get into the 70s. I think we make it to the 80s in the book with some of the characters. The interesting part is that a lot of the stories are intermixed. So Lucy is, I think, one of the central characters, and she comes out of the boarding school and is like put on a bus and sent to Vancouver. She doesn't know anyone. Macy is one of the girls that was her friend there, and so she had a letter from her with an address, and so she tries to find Macy. She ends up getting taken advantage of by a gross man. Like, all the white people in the story are pretty gross. And then we see Macy's story and how Macy is doing in Vancouver and how she's coping with her trauma and she's not coping very well with it. And then this will bleed into other stories. Kenny and Lucy saw each other. They were separated. The boys and girls were separated. And so every time they got in trouble, they had to stand next to each other in their punishment. And so they had that kind of relationship. And then Kenny looks for Lucy when she comes out. And so we see Kenny's story. Clara and Howie, again, it's the connection. Clara knows Lucy because of Macy, and Howie knows Kenny, and so they all kind of end up coming together, and you see them in the separate stories. So each section is the point of view of a different character. Again, super, super sad. I'm glad that I read it. Again, it's always important to know our history so that we don't repeat it, and to know what, when people are talking about, like, these schools and how traumatic it was, not just in the school, but living outside of the school as well. So it's a good book. It's her debut book, so I'm excited to see what else she comes up with. But just be prepared to be super sad. Okay, thanks for stopping by. Next month, we are traveling to Cabo Verde or Cape Verde. If you're interested in what we are reading or what we've read in the past, please visit us on Goodreads or Instagram. See you then.